She hadn't planned to stop. Didn't need bread. Didn't need nails. Didn't need anything. Really, not anymore. But something about the way the wind shifted made her pull the reins toward the square. That's when she saw them. 3 boys, sacks tied. Over their heads like burlap masks, hands bound behind their backs, standing still beside a hand-painted sign that said, "Orphans, $3 apiece. Sis, no names, no ages, just that." Martha Langley stepped down from her wagon, boots striking the dirt. Like a challenge. No one noticed at first. No one ever did. The town had long since stopped caring where the widow Langley went or why. She did her shopping twice a month, always in black, always silent, never lingering for gossip or prayer meetings. But now she walked straight into the crowd that had formed around the post where the boy stood, and every head turned. Not because she looked strange, but because her eyes did. The auctioneer, a red-faced man with 2 short suspenders, cleared. His throat. "Ma'am, you here for one?" She didn't answer. One of the boys swayed, the tallest. He was older, maybe 11, maybe 12. His knees buckled slightly, but he caught himself. The other 2 didn't move. $3 each, the man said again, scratching at his neck. Farmer up north said he might take him use 'em for sheep herdin'. Martha stepped closer, still didn't speak. The auctioneer looked nervous now. "You understand, Mom? These boys ain't house-a-ringed. Don't talk much. Don't cry either. Haven't eaten today. They've been like that since sunrise. Orders from the cellar. Don't untie the sacks. Still nothing. Could be mute. Could be worse." He chuckled awkwardly. "You don't know what you're buying, is all I'm saying." Martha reached into her coat, pulled out a worn leather purse. Inside were 6 silver dollars and 1 folded scrap of paper that smelled like lavender and dust. She pressed the coins into the man's palm. "All 3, she said. He blinked. "Pardon, untie them." But now the crowd watched, with breath held and mouths open. The man hesitated and muttered something under his breath and stepped forward, knife in hand. One by one he cut the rope binding each sack. The fabric fell away. The oldest boy had pale blue eyes too wide for his thin face. His jaw was clenched, but he didn't flinch. The middle one had a bruise under one eye and a scab on his lip. His eyes darted between faces, not focusing on any of them. The smallest, just a child, no more than 6, stared straight at Martha. Then he whispered, "Mrs. Langley." Not loud, not scared, just certain. The crowd rustled. Someone coughed. A woman muttered, "How does he know her?" Martha didn't answer. She stepped forward, placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, then the middle one, then the eldest. "Come with me." The auctioneer called after her. "You don't even know their names." But she didn't stop. She didn't need their names. She just needed them to live. They rode back in silence. The boys sat in the back of the wagon, clutching their knees, eyes on the road. She didn't ask them questions, didn't hand them bread or water. Not yet. Martha knew better than to offer comfort too quickly. It scared the ones who'd been hurt the worst. Her house sat on the edge of the valley, where the pines grew taller and the creek ran fast. The fields had long since gone to seed. The barn leaned to one side, and the windows hadn't been scrubbed in months, but it stood, and it was hers. The boys didn't move when she stopped in front of the porch. "Inside," she said. The eldest was the first to jump down. He helped the others without a word. They followed her into the house like shadows, steps quiet, breath tighter than it should have been. Inside, the stove still held warmth from the morning. She set a kettle on, opened a cupboard, pulled down a jar of dried beans and a sack of flour. "Sit," she said. They did. She stirred batter with one hand, watched them with the other. "What's your name?" She asked the smallest. He hesitated. "Mo," he whispered. She nodded. "Yours?" The middle one looked down. "Horace." The oldest looked at her a long time before he spoke. "Beck." She set the pan on the stove and began spooning batter into it. "I'm Martha. You said my name, Milo." "How'd you know it?" He shrugged. "Just knew." "Did someone tell you about me?" "No." "Did we meet before?" He shook his head. "Then how?" He looked at her. Really looked like a boy too young to lie, but too old to trust. "The truth. I heard it when I was sleeping. A lady said it. She said, 'Martha Langley will come. She'll take you home.'" The batter sizzled. Beck stiffened. Harris glanced at the floor. Martha didn't move. "What lady?" "She didn't say her name." Milo scratched at his wrist. Voice barely audible, but she was kind and warm like you. The room was quiet for a long time. Then Beck stood. "I don't care how he knew your name," he said. "But if you're going to hurt us, do it quick. Don't drag it out." Martha turned, brow furrowing. "I won't hurt you." "They all say that." "Well," she said, flipping the pancakes, "I won't say it again." She fed them. They ate like wolves. No conversation, no laughter, just the scrape of forks and the clink of mugs. When the plates were empty, she brought out blankets, laid them near the hearth. "You sleep here tonight. Clean clothes are in the chest. If you run, I won't come after you, but I'll leave the lantern on until morning." She turned, stepped toward the stairs. Then she stopped. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "we'll talk about what happens next." But they didn't sleep, and neither did she, because what Milo said replayed in her mind over and over, words she'd never told anyone, not even the Lord, not even when she was on her knee beside her husband's grave. "Let someone need me again," she'd whispered into the soil. "Let someone say my name." And now a boy had. And 3 lives, maybe 4, were about to change forever. Morning came without ceremony. The clouds held gray over the Langley house as though the sky itself had stayed up watching. Martha had barely closed her eyes, but the moment the rooster crowed, half-hearted and distant, she was already dressed, already downstairs, already starting the fire again. The boys hadn't moved much. Milo was curled under the blanket nearest the hearth, a thumb pressed gently against his bottom lip, not quite sucking it, just holding it like something to keep the silence company. Harris was lying rigid on his back, hands clenched over his chest like a boy, expecting to be dragged out by his collar. Beck sat upright in the farthest corner, knees tucked to his chest, head up, watching the door, watching her. None of them spoke. Martha poured water from the kettle into a basin, rolled up her sleeves, and started mixing soap. She didn't ask who was hungry. She knew they were. Didn't ask who was dirty. That much was obvious, too. She didn't crowd them. Not yet. But when she set a stack of folded shirts and woolen trousers on the bench beside the stove, her voice was calm and firm. "You can wash in the barn. There's privacy there. Towels are in the red box. Beck, you go first, then Harris. Milo, you're last. Don't come back in until you're clean." None of them moved at first. Beck's jaw tightened. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I want to. People don't do things just to be kind." She met his eyes. "That's because people forget how much kindness can cost." He didn't answer, but a minute later he got up, took the clothes, and disappeared through the back door. By the time Harris had followed, Martha was already mixing oats into a pot of boiling water, slicing apples, and adding cinnamon she'd saved for a day she didn't think would come. Milo lingered in the doorway after the other 2 had gone. Small, shoulders hunched. "Can I keep my name?" he asked. She turned. "Why wouldn't you?" He looked down. "People change them if they take you in." "I won't." "Good," he whispered. "'Cause I think God gave it to me." Something in her chest wavered. "You warm enough?" she asked. He nodded. "Go on, then." He trotted barefoot toward the barn. The sky lightened as they bathed and changed. Beck was the last to return, hair still damp, shirt too big, but clean. He didn't sit, just stood at the table like he was waiting for orders. "I'll do chores," he said. "You don't need to." "I want to." That changed things. Martha led him outside, showed him the tool shed, the old chicken coop, the vegetable patch that hadn't seen a spade in months. Beck didn't ask questions, just nodded and got to work. She sent Harris to stack firewood. Milo followed her through the house, helping her fold linens and collect dishes. It wasn't a perfect day. There were awkward silences, sudden flinches. Milo dropped a plate when she spoke too sharply about the mud on his boots. Harris wouldn't meet her eyes. Beck didn't come in for lunch. But by the time the sun had dipped past the ridge, there was warmth in the house that hadn't been there in years. And then a knock. 3 short raps. Martha froze. The boys looked up. She opened the door and found Reverend Jacob Stokes standing on her porch, tall, lean, in a black coat, with hands folded like he was praying, even when he was. "Afternoon, Martha," he said. "Heard you made a purchase in town." She stepped outside, closed the door behind her. "I brought them home. Wasn't sure it was you. Some of the townsfolk thought you'd gone mad. Maybe I have. They're not livestock, I know. They've been passed between more homes than most dogs, Martha. People take them, then bring them back. That one boy, Beck, he broke a man's nose with a horseshoe. He won't be breaking mine." Reverend Stokes looked at her for a long time, then sighed. "You want me to help get their names written with the county clerk? Make it official." "Not yet. I need to know they'll stay." "I wouldn't count on that. Not with their history." She looked past him at the hills, then back, "and I'll make new history." He smiled faintly. "You always were stubborn." "I learned from the best." He tipped his hat, turned to go. "Martha." She looked back. "I hope you know what you're doing. Taking in one boy is hard enough. 3, that's a resurrection." She didn't reply. Inside, Milo was peeking from behind the curtain. "Who was that?" "Just someone who worries too much." "He's scared," Milo said, "of what might happen to us." "So am I." That night, she pulled out an old Bible from her trunk, set it on the table. The boys watched. "I read from this when I was your age," she said. "Sometimes it helped, sometimes it didn't. But I thought maybe you'd want to hear something from it tonight." They didn't answer, so she read anyway. "He saith the solitary in families. He bringeth out those which are bound with chains." She didn't look up, just turned the page and kept going. By the time she closed it, Milo was asleep on the bench. Harris was curled up in a blanket, and Beck, though his eyes were open, wasn't watching the door anymore. He was watching her. She blew out the lantern, and for the first time in years, the silence of the house didn't feel empty. The next morning, there was blood in the snow. Not a lot, just a trail, thin and broken, leading from the back of the house toward the trees. Martha followed it, heart tight in her throat. The boys were still asleep. At least she thought they were. She hadn't woken them. Not yet. Not until she knew. The trail twisted between the trees, barely visible, interrupted by boot prints, too. Small for a man, too heavy for a fox. She followed it past the fence line, down the ravine, and into the copse where the pines grew thick. And there she found him, Beck, kneeling beside a snare trap, his hand wrapped in cloth, face blank. A rabbit struggled in the loop beside him, half dead, bleeding from the belly. "I didn't mean to," he said. Martha stepped closer. "I wanted to help. Thought I could get breakfast, but it fought me." He didn't cry, didn't wince, just stared at the rabbit, then at her. Will it die? Yes, I'm sorry. She crouched, gently, took the animal, and ended its pain with a rock. Quick, silent. She wrapped it in a cloth and looked at his hand. You need stitches. I've had worse. I'm sure you have, but you won't again, not here. She cleaned the wound. Back at the house, stitched it by lamplight while he stared straight ahead. Harris and Milo sat at the table, silent, watching. I want to learn to trap, right? Beck said. You will. And to shoot. Why? So I can protect them. Martha met his eyes. All right, but not today. He nodded. When he lay down that night, he didn't. Curl against the wall, he lay facing the room, facing them, facing her. And Martha, after the boys had drifted off, whispered into the dark, "Thank you." She didn't say who she was thanking. She didn't need to. It was the scream that tore her. From sleep. Not a startled cry, not a childish whimper, but a raw animal scream that wrenched through the walls like it had torn itself straight from the spine. Martha bolted upright, heart slamming. It was still dark, maybe an hour before dawn, but there was no mistaking where it had come from. The boys' room. She didn't bother with slippers. Her nightgown tangled around her ankles as she rushed down the hall, nearly colliding with the doorframe. She flung it open. Beck was thrashing. His body was slick with sweat, sheets twisted around his legs, one hand clawing the air like he was reaching for something in a fire. His eyes were shut tight, but his mouth was open wide, the scream still echoing out of him, hoarse now and breaking. Milo was sitting up in the cot beside him, hands over his ears. Harris stood frozen by the window, too afraid to move. Beck, Martha said sharply, "Wake up." He didn't. His arms jerked. A choked sob rose up. Words barely began to form in the cries. "Stop. Please stop. Not again. No more, please." Martha didn't hesitate. She crossed the room, dropped to her knees beside him, and gripped his shoulders. "Beck, it's not real. You're safe. You're home." His eyes flew open. His whole body snapped rigid, as if he'd been doused in cold water. Then he gasped one huge rattling breath, and he recoiled so fast he nearly fell from the bed. "Don't touch." He shouted. "It's Martha," she said calmly, not moving. "You were dreaming." He blinked, looked around the room like he didn't recognize it. His chest heaved. Sweat rolled down his temples. Milo had started crying softly, a broken sort of sound like someone trying not to cry and failing. Beck covered his face. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake anyone. I didn't mean." His voice broke. Harris stepped forward, still pale but steady now. "He does this sometimes," he said. "Not always this bad, but sometimes." "Should I go sleep in the barn?" Beck asked. "I'll be quiet." "I swear." "I'll be quiet." "No one's going to the barn," Martha said. "You're staying here." He lowered his hand slowly. "I scared him," he said, nodding toward Milo. Milo wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his shirt and whispered, "It's okay." "I dreamed he was back," Beck said. "The man the one who bought us before the last place. I don't remember his name, just his boots. He always smelled like rope. I thought I was back there." Martha felt her throat tighten. "You're not. I know. You're not." He nodded a little slower this time. They all sat in silence for a while, the only sound the wind outside scratching at the roof. Eventually, she spoke. "We'll make tea now," Harris asked. "It helps," Martha said, rising. "It helps remind us where we really are." They followed her, silent as shadows. In the kitchen, she lit the lantern, boiled water, and let each boy choose his own mug. Milo picked one with blue flowers. Harris chose the plain gray one. Beck didn't choose until she held one out herself, an old tin cup with a dent in the rim. He took it without a word. They sat at the table sipping slowly. Beck's hands still trembled, but his breathing eased. "Are nightmares like memories?" Milo asked, barely above a whisper. "They're what memories do when you try to forget them too fast," Martha said. That seemed to make sense to all of them, though no one said anything after. They stayed at the table till dawn. None of them returned to sleep, but when the rooster crowed again, it sounded less lonely. Later that morning, Martha handed Beck an axe. He stared at it. "You want me to chop wood?" "I want you to do something that makes your arms tired and your mind quiet," she said. "But you're not touching that pile until I show you how. You nick that blade, and I'll have you sharpening it till Easter." He nodded. It was a slow process. Beck was strong but unused to proper tools. He'd been handed things before, knives, belts, ropes, but never taught to use them right. Martha corrected his grip, showed him the difference between splitting a log and splitting a knuckle. By noon, he was sweating and focused, and the pile of kindling was growing. Harris helped her in the garden. He didn't talk much, but she saw how he handled things carefully. Seeds, roots, dirt, as if they might vanish if pressed too hard. When he found a worm, he picked it up gently, set it aside, and kept digging. "Did you ever have a family?" he asked suddenly. "I did." "Where are they now?" "Gone." He didn't press, just nodded. Martha appreciated that. Some boys asked to wound. Others asked because they were looking for parts of themselves. Harris asked like he was trying to see how much loss he might survive. Inside, Milo was sweeping, not because anyone told him to, but because he liked making. Little lines on the floor. He sang to himself softly, old hymns without full verses, just fragments he remembered. "This little light of mine," he murmured again and again, not seeming to realize she could hear. That afternoon, Martha found herself humming the same tune while baking. 3 days passed, then 4, then a week. The boys began to change, though. None of them noticed it. Harris started reading aloud by the fire. He wasn't good at it. He stumbled over long words, but Milo always clapped anyway. Beck stopped asking to do chores. He just did them. Martha caught him once repairing a hinge on the barn door with a nail he'd found. And when she asked who showed him how, he shrugged. "You did," he said, "when you fixed the gate latch." Milo began leaving little drawings under her pillow. Crayon things smudged and barely decipherable, but always with her in them, always with the word home scrolled somewhere in the corner. But it wasn't perfect. One night, Harris came home with a black eye. Martha saw it the moment he walked in. "What happened?" "Nothing. Don't lie to me." He looked at his feet. "Town boys said we were trash. Called Beck names. I told them to stop. They didn't. Did Beck fight back? No, he just stood there." "Why didn't you run?" He shrugged. "We don't run anymore." Martha knelt. "Let me see." He lifted his chin. She touched it gently. "You're brave," she said. "Foolish, too. Sometimes they're the same thing." She cleaned the wound. That night, she made hot stew and let them all sit closer to the fire than usual. Beck didn't say much, but he slid Harris an extra slice of bread when he thought no one was looking. A letter arrived the next morning, postmarked from town. Martha almost didn't open it, but the handwriting was familiar, tight, legal. It was from the county. She read it twice, folded it, put it in her apron pocket. After breakfast, she asked the boys to sit. "I've been asked to bring you into town," she said. The room went still. "Why?" Beck asked. "They want to ask you questions. Make sure you're doing well, that I'm fit." "We don't want to go," Milo said. "You don't have to stay," she said gently. "But you have to come with me. You have to show them what we've built here. Beck stood slowly if they try to take us. They won't. Not if we show them who you really are. Not what they've heard. Not who you. We're passed between like property, but the truth. What we've become together. No one spoke for a long time. Then Harris nodded. All right. The ride to town was long. No one spoke. When they arrived, the courthouse loomed like a brick sermon. Inside, the hall smelled of ink and varnish. The clerk looked down at them with suspicion. But the boys stood straight. Milo held Beck's hand. Harris didn't fidget once. The man asked questions. Do you sleep through the night? Do you get meals? Do you feel safe? Each boy answered, calm, clear. Beck's voice only cracked once, and when it did, he lifted his chin and repeated the word stronger. Yes. When it was done, the clerk leaned back. You're lucky, he said. She could have left you to rot. Not many would take in 3 of you. Not after what we've seen. She didn't take us in, Beck said. The man blinked. She did. We chose her. That night when they returned home, there was a new drawing under Martha's pillow. It was of 4 stick figures holding hands in front of a crooked little house with smoke from the chimney and stars overhead. On the roof, someone had written in big letters, Found. And for the first time since burying her husband, Martha cried. She didn't do it in secret. She didn't hide her face. She sat at the table and wept. The boys didn't ask why. They just stayed with her. The first snow came early. It blew and quiet, thin at first, like lace pulled across the mountains. But by morning, the hills had vanished behind a blanket of white, and the sky hung low and gray. Martha stood on the porch in her shawl, breath rising in little clouds, watching the wind weave itself through the trees. Inside, the boys were bundled by the stove, sharing a single wool blanket between them like it was treasure. Milo had never seen snow before. He sat closest to the window, his mouth open in wonder, leaving little foggy patches on the glass. Is it cold? He asked. Freezing, Beck said without looking up. Can I touch it? You can touch it all you want, but don't go out there without boots, or your toes will snap off like brittle twigs. Milo laughed, but didn't move. Beck had a way of teasing that always walked the line between serious and ridiculous. And Milo was still too young to know when he was being warned or played. Martha smiled and turned back inside. Breakfast, she called. Hot biscuits, but only if you set the table right. His rose first, always the responsible one. Beck followed, stretching his long arms. Milo scampered to his place, his head still swiving to the window, trying to catch every flake before it hit the ground. They ate in a silence that had stopped being uncomfortable weeks ago. It was a silence of understanding now, of warmth and chewing, and eyes meeting over mugs of tea. Martha found herself watching them longer than she meant to. Why are you looking at us like that? Beck asked, a biscuit halfway to his mouth. I'm just proud, she said, her voice quieter than she intended. The boys paused. It was Milo who reached out and took her hand. He didn't say anything, just held it. That afternoon, they built a snowman. Not because anyone told them to, but because Milo insisted they had to try. He needs arms, Milo said, circling the lumpy figure. And a hat. Give him yours, Beck teased. No way. My ears will freeze off. You're the one who wanted to build a snowman. I didn't say he needed to hear anything, Milo said smartly, and Beck burst out laughing. Harris came out with a couple sticks and an old tin lid for a hat. Martha watched from the porch, a mug of tea in her hands, the sound of laughter and boots. Crunching in snow swirling around her like the best kind of music. It had been a long, long time since she'd heard children laugh in the yard, since her husband's voice had joined them, since she'd let herself imagine the sound returning. But now it had, And it wasn't just noise. It was life. By sundown, the sky burned gold over the white hills, and the boys came in soaked to the bone, but beaming. She made stew, and they peeled off their wet clothes, hanging them by the fire like old rags, steam rising from the boots. Milo curled up in one of her old shawls. Beck brought out a deck of cards. "Who wants to lose tonight?" He challenged. "You always cheat," Harris said. "You just always lose." Same thing. They played 3 games, then fell asleep right there on the floor in a tangle of arms and limbs, the way only brothers, real or chosen, could. Martha didn't wake them. She draped another blanket over the pile of boys and sat beside the stove until the coals turned red and low. The wind howled outside, but the cabin held tight. The trouble came 5 days later. Martha had gone into town. Alone. Supplies were low, and the boys were busy patching the hen coop after a raccoon tore through it in the night. It was supposed to be a short trip, but when she reached the general store, something was off. The man behind the counter, Gerald Wash, stopped stacking flour and looked up. He was never friendly, but today he looked uneasy. "Something wrong?" Martha asked. He scratched his neck, heard a rider came in asking questions about the boys. Her hands went still on the counter. "What kind of questions?" "The kind you don't want strangers asking." Said he had papers. Said he was family. Martha felt her gut tighten. What name? Didn't give one. Rode off before anyone could stop him. But he headed east toward your place. She left the supplies. Didn't even pack them up. She rode harder than she had in years, her old mare kicking up snow and slush as they tore down the road, her breath fogging in the cold, her heart pounding louder than hooves. When she crested the last hill, the cabin came into view and a horse was tied outside. A dark horse, saddlebags heavy with something she couldn't see. The boys were still inside. She jumped down and ran. The door was open. Inside, the boys stood, in a row, silent, back stiff. In front of them, a man in a dark coat, tall, pale, a mustache that curled at the edges like a villain from a dime novel. He held a folder in one hand, and in the other something worse. A sag, the same kind the boys had worn when she first saw them. "Step away from them," Martha said. The man turned slowly. "You must be the widow. You must be lost." "I'm not. I've come for what's mine. They're not yours." He opened the folder. "Ward transfer papers signed by Judge Hammond 2 counties over. I paid good money. You paid for flesh, not for family." He tilted his head. "That's a pretty word for stolen property." "You say that again," Beck said, voice shaking, "and I'll knock your teeth out." The man laughed. "You think you can fight me, boy?" "I already did." "You're a feral dog," the man said, stepping forward. "You and your little mutts." "Then we bite," Harris said, stepping beside Beck. Milo clung to Martha's side. The man reached into his coat. Martha moved first. The rifle from the mantel was already in her hands. She raised it, eyes steady. "Try it." He froze. "You think I won't?" She asked. "I think you're scared." "I am," she said. "But that do mean I won't pull the trigger." The man's hand hovered, then slowly he lowered it. "You'll pay for this," he said. "They always find out, always." "They already did," she said, "and they left them with me." He backed to the door, tied the sack to his saddle, and rode off. She didn't lower the rifle until the sound of hooves vanished completely. That night, none of them slept. They sat by the fire, huddled close, the warmth doing little to settle the tremble that lingered in Milo's hands or the hard set of Beck's jaw. "They'll come back," Beck said. Martha nodded. "Maybe, but we'll be ready. Next time we fight." "No," she said. "Next time we stay together." They think we're weak, Harris said. Then let them think it, she replied. It's easier to surprise them that way. Beck gave a dry laugh. The next morning, she went into town again, this time with all 3 boys. She marched them into the courthouse, straight into the judge's office, and dropped the papers the man had left on the desk. I didn't sign these, Judge Tomlin said, adjusting his spectacles. Hammond's retired. Hasn't signed anything in years. Then someone's forging legal documents to snatch children. He paled. We'll handle this, he said. You have my word. I don't want promises, she said. I want names, and I want peace. He nodded. She left the courthouse with her arm around Milo's shoulders. That winter passed like a slow song. The days short, the nights long, but filled with the kind of quiet routine that made life bearable. The boys learned to bake. Beck built a sled. Harris read every book in the attic and then reread them. Milo started learning to write. His first word wasn't cat or dog. It was Martha. He left it written in chalk on the cabin wall. When she saw it, she cried again, not loudly, not for long, but real tears. By the time spring came, they had planted a new garden. By summer, it was growing strong, and the boys, each in their own way, had learned how to grow with it. The garden rose bent in tidy arcs, like stitched seams along the earth, and Martha moved between them with her sleeves rolled to her elbows and a basket in her arm, humming under her breath. By now the boys could tell her mood from the hum. Today it was a calm one, soft and low like a hymn. The cabbage heads were full and tight, and Milo ran beside her, carrying the smaller basket, wobbling slightly under its weight. His handwriting had improved since winter. His RS still came out backwards sometimes, but his name, Milo, was sharp and proud on every paper she gave him. Martha, he said, huffing as he walked behind her. Can we cook it all today? She looked down at him. You want cabbage stew again? We got Beck's birthday soon. Should make something special. It's not for 2 weeks. Then we got time to make it. Perfect. She smiled, brushing soil from a head of lettuce. We'll think of something. Up near the coop, Beck and Harris worked in rhythm, shoveling, lifting, hammering. The boys had taken to the work like they'd been born into it, not dragged here with bags over their heads and bruises on their backs. Beck had grown a few inches taller since the winter. His sleeves didn't reach his wrists anymore, and Harris's voice had deepened just slightly, enough for Martha to hear it change, even when the boys pretended not to notice. Time was moving just slow enough to feel it in their bones. But peace, like all things, never lasted forever in places like this. The first warning came in the form of a letter. No name, no address, just folded parchment slipped into the crack of the door late one night. Martha found it when she stepped out with her lamp, the oil burning low. It was written in careful penmanship, but the words were sharp. You stole them. That won't be forgotten. She burned it in the fireplace and didn't tell the boys. The second warning came 2 weeks later. A chicken was missing. Then a goat found dead, neck snapped, left with no signs of struggle. Beck found it before Milo could see. They buried it near the garden. I think it was wolves, Harris said. Wolves don't snap necks and leave the body untouched, Beck replied. Someone sending a message. Martha didn't argue. She just started locking the door and keeping the rifle loaded. Beck's birthday came with storm clouds and thunder that trembled the window panes. They lit the cabin with every candle they could find. Milo made him a wooden whistle he carved himself. Harris gave him a hand-stitched pouch for carrying nails and tools. Martha gave him a new coat, dark wool, fine stitching. It had belonged to her late husband, but now it fit back almost exactly. I can't take this, he said quietly, his eyes not quite meeting hers. You already have, she replied. He wore it the next morning without saying a word. That was the day everything changed. It began with the dog, a stray mutt, yellow-eyed and ribs showing through his mangy fur, limped up to the property just before noon. Milo saw it first through the kitchen window. It was raining again, thin sheets that made everything look blurred. The dog stood near the edge of the tree awning, staring at the house. "Dog," Milo whispered, tugging Martha's sleeve. She stepped over and squinted out the window. "Not a good sign," she murmured. Beck had already gone outside. "Go back inside," she told him through the window, but he shook his head. "I just want to see." Then the dog ran, but not toward them. Away. And just as it vanished into the woods, a sound rang out through the trees. A sound Martha hadn't heard in years. Gunfire. One shot. Then silence. Then three more. Beck dropped flat to the ground. Harris pulled Milo from the window. Martha didn't move. Her heart pounded loud in her ears, but her body had gone still. She knew that rhythm. A warning shot, then a real one. Then, too, to prove it wasn't an accident. Someone was watching, and they were closing in. They didn't sleep that night. Martha made the boys stay in the kitchen, away from the windows. They ate cold bread and beans. Beck kept the rifle on his lap the whole time, jaw tight, eyes flicking to every corner. He'd grown fast since winter, but that night he looked older than any boy his age should have. "Do you think they'll come in the dark?" Harris asked. "No," Martha said. "Cowards don't walk through shadows. They wait for light." So they waited, and the morning brought nothing but fog. Still they stayed inside 2 days, 3. By the 4th day, they were low on food. "I can go into town." Beck said, "I'm faster." "You're a boy." She said, "They'll be looking for you." He didn't argue. Instead, she took the long trail, avoided the road. It cost her 3 hours each way. When she returned, her face was pale. "What is it?" Harris asked. "There's a man in town. New keeps asking about me. Keeps asking if I live alone. Did you tell anyone?" "I didn't need to," she said. "Sheriff already ran him out, but he wasn't working alone." That night, she unpacked a box she hadn't opened in years. Inside was her husband's old revolver, a spare, box of ammunition, and a map. She unfolded the map across the kitchen table. "There's a safe place 3 valleys over, a church-run homestead. They help families. If I leave tonight, I can speak with the pastor there by morning." "You're going alone?" Harris asked. "I need someone to stay and keep you safe if I'm gone more than 2 days." "We're not leaving," Beck said. She looked at him. "If they come," he said, "we stay together. That's exactly what I'm afraid of." But he didn't back down. In the end, she left at dusk, rode out with the revolver strapped to her side, a satchel of dry bread and jerky in her saddlebag, and the hope she'd return before anything went wrong. She didn't get far. By sunrise, she was less than 10 miles out when the storm hit. Not a storm of weather, but of sound, hoof beats in the distance, then a whistle. She turned her horse down a narrow creek, but they were faster. Within an hour, she was surrounded by 3 riders, men in dust coats, faces covered in scarves, guns drawn. She didn't flinch. "Where are you headed, miss?" the lead one asked. "Church," she said. "Not that it's any of your business." "It's not," he said, circling her slowly. "But those 3 boys you've been harboring are harboring," she spat. "They were dumped like trash. I gave them a home. You stole them from someone who paid good money. Then maybe the system's broken." He laughed. "Maybe it is. Doesn't change this law. Then maybe the law is broken, too. You're awful brave, miss, for someone surrounded." "I've got enough lead to fill all 3 of you," she said, lifting her revolver. "And I've got friends," he said, whistling again. Behind her, 4 more. Men stepped out of the trees. She didn't lower the weapon, but she didn't fire either. Instead, she dismounted. "If you take me," she said, "you'll have to drag me. I'm not walking anywhere with men like you." "You won't need to," the leader said. And then he struck her. But back at the cabin, the boys waited. First one day, then two. By the third, Beck couldn't sit still. She wouldn't leave us. She might have gotten stuck, Harris said. Injury, storm, anything. Beck shook his head. Something happened. He opened the box she left behind. The second revolver, a map, the names of the church folks she meant to see. "We go after her," he said. "We can't leave, Milo." Milo looked up. "I'm coming." "You're not strong enough." "I don't care. She's my ma." That stopped them both. In all the time they'd been there, none of them had dared say it aloud. But there it was. Truth on a 7-year-old's lips. They packed the next morning, left the garden behind, left the chickens, left everything they'd built except what they could carry. They followed the trail she said she'd take. And what they found at the halfway mark made Beck fall to his knees. Her horse shot through the chest. No sign of her, just a trail of blood barely visible in the dirt leading east. Away from town, away from the church, into the hills where men took people when they didn't want them found. Beck rose, eyes filled with fire. He turned to Harris. "We're bringing her home." They moved before sunrise, hugging the treine where fog sat thick like breath held too long. Beck led Map, tucked under one arm and revolver holstered at his hip. A weapon that looked too large for a boy not yet 16, though he carried it like it belonged to him. Harris took the rear, checking over. His shoulder every dozen steps, every twig crackling beneath their boots, drawing a glance. Milo walked between them, his stride small but sure, fists baldled at his sides. The crude wooden slingshot strapped across his chest, more for confidence than use. He hadn't spoken since they found the horse. But he hadn't cried either, not one tear. He'd simply looked at the blood in the mud, nodded once and said, "She's alive." They believed him, because believing otherwise wasn't an option. The hills were cruel. Vines and thorns clawed at their legs, and the air turned thin. The higher they climbed. Harris found a boot print in the soft earth, small, narrow, with a drag mark behind it. A woman's step, weak but recent. Beck knelt beside it, fingers tracing the indentation. His lips moved, but no sound came. "A prayer, maybe, or a memory. We're close," he finally said. Real close. The cabin appeared by accident. They were cutting through a narrow gap in the rocks when Milo grabbed Beck's sleeve and pointed. Beyond the trees, through a lattice of overgrowth, sat a weather-beaten shack, tilted slightly as if the mountain itself had grown tired of holding it up. Smoke curled faint from the chimney, faint, but alive. A red scarf hung from a nail on the porch, torn, familiar. "She's there," Milo whispered. "No guarantee," Harris said. "Could be a trap." "We can't wait," Beck answered. "We go quiet, fast, no noise." They crept forward. The boards of the porch groaned beneath Beck's boots. He motioned for Milo to stay behind the tree line. Harris followed close, knife drawn, crouched low. The door was cracked an inch. Beck pressed his ear to the frame. Nothing. He pushed. They? Hinges squealed and light spilled into a room choked with dust. The smell of old smoke and sweat and something metallic filled their noses. A table sat overturned. A chair broken. Rope coiled on the ground, frayed at the ends. "Over here," Harris whispered, pointing toward a dark corner. Marfa. She was tied to the bedpost, wrists red and raw, her dress torn at the sleeves. Her eyes were open, half-lidded with exhaustion. Lips cracked, a bruise purpling beneath one cheekbone. She didn't flinch when she saw them, Didn't cry out, just smiled. "I knew you'd come," she said. Beck was at her side in an instant, cutting through the bindings with a blade that shook in. His hand. "Did they hurt you?" he asked. "Not in the way they wanted," she replied, wincing as the ropes fell loose. Harris stepped to the window. "Number." "Sign of them. They'll be back," Martha whispered. "They only left to get supplies. There's more. They're not just after me. They're after the boys. Some new buyer. Said, orphans like you fetch good coin, especially if you're broken in already." Milo's voice came from the door. "They're coming." He was supposed to stay back, but he stood there now, holding a rock in one hand, his eyes wide. 3 men coming up the trail. They had minutes less. Beck pulled Martha to her feet. She staggered. "I can run," she said. "You can lean," he replied, slinging her arm over his shoulder. The escape wasn't clean. The back door led to a ravine steep and littered with moss-covered stones. Beck went first, helping Martha slide down, Harris following close behind. Milo was last. He didn't make it halfway before the shout came from above. "They're down the hill." Gunfire tore through the quiet, splintering bark and kicking dust into the air. Harris spun, returning a single shot up the ridge. One of the men dropped, the others scattered, but not for long. "They'll circle," Beck said. "We can't outrun bullets." Martha gritted her teeth. "There's a mine shaft, old, about half a mile east. My husband used to trap there. If it's still standing, it'll buy us time. Then that's where we go." They ran. The path was rough. The rain had loosened the earth, turning it to slick clay. Twice Milo slipped, each time hauled up by Harris's grip. Beck moved like a shadow, Martha leaning heavier with each step, her breath coming in short bursts. They reached the mine just as the sky darkened with incoming storm clouds. The entrance was half collapsed, boards sagging inward, but the tunnel still yawned open like a waiting mouth. Beck didn't hesitate. He led them in, lanterns swinging from his belt, the light barely cutting through the dark. Inside, the air was damp. Old rails lined the floor, rusted and crooked. A small cart sat on its side, filled with rocks and dirt. Farther in, Beck said, "We'll find a pocket to hide." Milo tugged at his sleeve. "What if it caves in?" "Then we take the risk, because outside was worse." The echo of boots came less than 10 minutes later. 2 men, then a third, voices low and angry. "I told you I heard him down here somewhere. They won't get far. This place is a coffin." Beck positioned himself at a bend in the tunnel. He handed Martha the revolver. She looked at him startled. "You shoot if they get too close. No questions." "I won't let them take you," she said. He nodded once and slipped into the dark. The ambush was fast. Beck waited until the first man passed, then struck with a piece of iron rail, catching him across the temple. The second spun, shouting, but Harris tackled him from the side, knife flashing in the dim. The third raised his pistol, then went down with a gunshot from behind. Martha stood at the tunnel mouth, smoke curling from her weapon. Her hands shook. I didn't think I would." "You did," Beck said, helping her lower the gun. "You saved us. We're not safe yet." And they were. The last man wasn't dead. He groaned, reaching for his weapon, blood streaming down his cheek. "Please," he rasped. "I didn't. I was just doing a job." Beck looked at Martha. She stepped forward, leaned down, and took his weapon. "You tell whoever sent you," she said, voice firm and cold. "If they come near my boys again, I'll put the next one between their eyes." She stood. "We leave him. Let him crawl back." They exited the mine by a city shaft Beck remembered from the map. It took them twice as long to circle the ridge and reach the base, but by sunset they were clear of the hills, clear of the blood, the shack, the mine. By morning, they were home. It took weeks before anyone spoke of what happened. Milo finally asked one night, his voice soft as he dried dishes beside. "Martha, will they come back?" She didn't answer right away. "They might," she said, "but we're stronger now." Beck built a second fence. Harris set traps. Martha got a dog, a big solemn hound that slept at the foot of her bed, and never let the front porch sit empty. And slowly the fear faded, but not the memory. They planted a tree where the mine used to be, a small one, fragile but growing. For them, it was enough. The tree didn't bloom until spring, but when it did, Milo was the first to notice. He burst through the front door barefoot, face stir with mud, shouting so loud that Martha dropped the pie tin she was drying. The hound barked once and bounded after him, tail high. "It's got flowers," Milo yelled, "real ones, white." Martha followed him to the edge of the field where they'd buried the past. The sapling had pushed through the hard frost and stood barely shoulder high, covered in tiny blossoms. Fragile things, but brave. Beck knelt beside it, brushing a petal between calloused fingers. "Told you it would grow," he said. Harris stood behind him, arms crossed. "You said it would die in the first freeze." "Shut up," Martha laughed. The boys were healing, not just from the bruises or the cold, but from something deeper. The kind of hurt that no one saw, the ache of not being wanted. But even peace has a price. That night, someone knocked on the door. It wasn't gentle. 3 hard pounds, then silence. Beck was up first, hand on the revolver. Harris moved to the window, peeling back the curtain just an inch. "Rider," he whispered. "Alone, horse looks feared." Martha stepped into the hallway. "Let me open it. Martha, he's not here to hurt us." She said it with the certainty of a mother who knew things without needing proof. She opened the door. The rider wasn't a man at all. He was a boy barely older than Beck, hat too large for his. Head, boots worn to the soles. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he swayed in the saddle like he hadn't slept in days. A telegram was crumpled in his hand. "You Martha Boone?" He asked. "I am." He passed her the slip of paper. Came urgent said, "If I didn't ride straight, the kids might die." Her blood ran cold. She took the telegram and unfolded it with trembling. Hands, 3 boys taken. Southbound wagon crossed river headed for auction. Need help. C. She didn't need to ask who C was. The boys, especially Harris, had kept quiet about the network they'd once been entangled in. A broken pipeline that shuffled orphans across counties, parading them as farm help or church hands, only to sell them to the highest bidder. Some boys escaped. Some didn't, but some stayed and tried to stop it. C was one of those. And if C had sent this, it meant it was bad. "I'll ride," Beck said, already lacing his boots. "No," Martha said. "I will." The room froze. "You can't," Beck started. "I won't ask you to let me," she cut in. "I'm telling you. I've stood in this house long enough trying to make a home for boys who never knew what one looked like. If those 3 are out there, I'm not waiting for another grave tree to mark them." She turned to Harris. "Saddle both horses. We leave in an hour." He didn't argue. By dawn they were halfway down the ridge, rain chasing them like wolves. The trail was narrow and slick, the river swollen from storms upstream. They crossed at the shallow bend where the rocks turned red with clay. On the far bank, Martha dismounted and knelt beside a hoofprint. "Wagon," she said, "heavy 4 wheels." "How far?" "Not more than a day." They pressed on. The land changed. Trees thinned. Fields turned to dust. At dusk they came upon a trading post with its windows shuttered and the smell of blood hanging like smoke. The innkeeper was outside sweeping broken glass into a heap. 3 boys came through here, Martha said, bound. One was limping. The man looked up, eyes hard. Why should I tell you? Harris took a single step forward. Because if you don't, she'll ask again, and then I will. The man hesitated, then pointed south. Wagon broke an axle here, fixed it by dusk, headed to Porter's. Mill said something about a private auction. Harris cursed under his breath. Porter's mill was a day's ride, less if they didn't sleep. They didn't. By nightfall, they reached the edge of the valley. From the ridge, they could see smoke rising. From the chimneys below, dozens of tents pitched along the creek, men walking with rifles. A pen near the center made of stacked crates and barbed wire. 3 boys huddled. One clutched his stomach. Another had a sack still tied around his neck. Martha exhaled slowly. We go in quiet. No, Harris said. We go in loud. He opened his coat to reveal a stick of dynamite. You've been carrying that, Martha hissed. Only for the right cause. And now is. He looked down the hill. Now's the time. They waited until midnight. Martha moved first, slipping through the dark toward the crates. She didn't run, didn't crouch, just walked steady as if she belonged. A woman in a world of men, daring them to stop her. None did. The boys saw her and blinked. 2 days to speak. One reached out. She pressed a finger to her lips. Then she cut the wire. Harris struck the fuse from behind a barrel. Flame catching. The cord just as Beck sent the horse into a charge from the opposite end of camp. The explosion wasn't large, but it was loud. It scattered the tents, sent guards scrambling, gave Martha the opening she needed to pull the boys from the crate and run. They didn't look back. They rode through the night. No one followed, or if they did, they never caught up. By dawn, they reached the tree again, still blooming. The boys were safe. But something had changed. Weeks later, C arrived. He rode a mule and wore a hat so wide it shadowed his whole face. But he smiled when he saw Martha. You got my message. I did. He reached into his coat and handed her a ledger. Names, ages, destinations. Still more out there, he said. Too many. She didn't look away. Then we keep going. You and the boys. Me and whoever wants to help. She nodded once. Welcome to the fight. That night, Beck sat on the porch, lantern in his lap. Milo curled asleep against the dog, and Harris leaned against the rail, carving something from a scrap of pine. You ever think we'll stop running? Beck asked. Martha came outside, the newest boy, Jonas, tucked beneath her arm. No, she said. But maybe we'll make a place where others don't have to. Jonas looked up at her, then at Beck. Are you my new family? Martha didn't hesitate. We're real one. And in the distance, lightning rolled across the hills. But for once, no one was afraid of the storm. The storm rolled in with a low grumble just past midnight. The rain didn't come all at once. It crept in slow, whispering against the windows like an old voice returning to a house it once knew. The boys didn't wake, not even Milo, who usually stirred at the slightest creak of the roof. They were too tired, too full, and for the first time in years, too safe to flinch. Martha sat by the hearth, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold. Beck slept near the fireplace, a book still open on his lap. Harris leaned against the doorframe, his eyes watching the trees shift in the wind. No one spoke for a long time. There was nothing that needed saying. The fire crackled low. Outside, the field swayed with the rhythm of the downpour. It was the kind of storm that cleared the air. Not one that brought fear, but one that swept out the ghosts. Martha finally set her mug down and looked toward the bedroom where the newest boys were sleeping. Jonas, Polly, Ben. Ben had been the last one rescued, the smallest. He still cried in his sleep sometimes, though he tried to hide it. But earlier that evening, he'd handed her a piece of torn paper with something scrolled in charcoal. Muhammad. That was all it said. No one had told him to write it. No one had even said the word aloud in days, but somehow he'd known. Martha kept it folded in her apron now, close to her heart. They're healing, she whispered. Harris nodded. So are we. Outside the wind shifted, bringing with it the scent of river mud and wild flowers, both lingering signs that spring was digging its heels in, new life pushing through old dirt. A week passed then, too. The house, once too quiet, now buzzed with sound. Laughter, bickering, singing off-key. Beck had started teaching the younger ones how to fish, though Milo swore the worms made him gag. Harris was carving each boy his own wooden toy. He claimed it was a gift, just something to keep your hands busy, but the care in every smooth edge said otherwise. Martha tended the garden. She added more rows this year. More mouths meant more to grow. Jonas liked to help her, not because he enjoyed the work, but because it gave him a reason to be near her. Every so often, he'd glance up from his digging and ask a question that didn't sound like a question at all. You think I'll get taller? A family? Beck read the letter twice. You going to say yes? Martha looked out the window where the boys were chasing fireflies in the yard. I already did. But years later, the tree still stood, taller now, thick with leaves. Under it, a small marker had been set, for the ones who never made it, and the ones who did. The house had grown, too. Bigger walls, more windows, laughter spilling. Out from every room, children of all ages. Some arrived with bruises, some with silence, but none stayed that way for long. Martha never turned anyone away. And in time, people began calling the house by another name, the Boon Light, because that's what it became, a light for the boys who were buried in cages and crates in silence, for the ones told they weren't worth keeping, for the ones digging their own graves until someone reached out and said, you don't have to, and for a quiet widowed woman who once lost everything and then gave everything to give them life.